If you've attended Courageous Conversations before, you know we spend a lot of time considering the important topic of trauma and its impact on victim survivors. We know that being abused by another person can leave a survivor with devastating wounds that take time and work to heal. Today, we turn our attention to another type of trauma, the harm perpetrated when a trusted or much loved institution turns against someone in its ranks and fails to protect them. Over the last decade, we've seen news stories about institutional betrayal in many types of organizations, including the military, universities, and companies. These stories often involve a person who speaks up and says that they were harmed in the institution, but the institution's leaders fail to take action. In some cases, the institution may even take aggressive steps against the person who spoke up and asked for help. Of course, today we'll be talking about institutional betrayal in the Catholic Church. This is an important topic because emerging research shows that betrayal by a much loved institution, such as the church, can be particularly harmful to victims, leading to wounds that are especially hard to heal. We will hear about some of that new research, discuss the tactics used by abusive institutions, and listen to personal stories from panelists who have experienced institutional betrayal themselves. We also hope to talk about healing from this form of harm and how the Catholic Church might begin to build institutional courage. So now let's turn to our speakers. Today, our panelists include Elisabeth Ingram, who is joining us today from the Oklahoma City area. Elisabeth is a trauma researcher and PhD student in counseling psychology at Oklahoma State University. She is also a survivor of adult abuse by a clergy member in a Protestant context. She describes her work as blending lived experience with clinical insights to expose truth, support survivors, and challenge complicit systems. She recently conducted a study of survivors of church abuse to understand their experience of institutional betrayal, including the psychological consequences of this form of trauma. We look forward to learning from you, Elisabeth. Next, let's introduce Bill Hambleton. Bill is based in Los Angeles, where he is chair of the Religious Studies and Theology Department at Flint Ridge Sacred Heart Academy, an all-girls Catholic school. Bill grew up Catholic in Salt Lake City, Utah, where he was molested by a priest beginning at age 16 and lasting until he was in college seminary. Bill left the seminary in 2001, but remains a devout Catholic. He is married and a longtime Catholic educator. In 2024, he reported his abuse for the very first time to the bishop of the Diocese of Salt Lake City. Last summer, he shared with a journalist at the Salt Lake Tribune his story of abuse and the frustrating process of reporting that abuse to church officials. We are honored to have you join us today, Bill, and look forward to hearing your insights. We are also joined today by Esther Harber, who lives in Dayton, Ohio, with her husband and 2 children. Esther is a much-loved member of the Awake community who served as Awake's former survivor care coordinator. Esther is a survivor of sexual assault and spiritual abuse perpetrated by a priest when she was a lay missionary in her 20s in New York City. She will share insights from her own experience, as well as the stories she has heard from the many survivors she has accompanied over the years. We are so grateful to have you here with us today, Esther. So let's begin our conversation. It will be moderated today by Erin O'Donnell, a volunteer member of Awake's Courageous Conversation team and a writer for the Awake blog. Erin?
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for that helpful introduction. And hello, everyone. It's so good to be together today. We obviously have a lot of great topics and interesting ideas to talk about today. As we get started, Elisabeth, I'd like to turn to you first as the academic researcher on our panel. I think it would be helpful for you to sort of flesh out some key terms that we're going to be using today, starting with the topic of betrayal trauma. What is it?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Erin. And I want to just say briefly before I talk about betrayal trauma, I'm so grateful to be here today. Conducting research in collaboration with other survivors has been a form of regaining my agency. And getting to talk about research is a way to reclaim my voice. So I'm very, very thankful to be here today with you all. So betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma is when someone you trust or depend on or has power over you harms you in some way. This is most easily accessible to think about, like the abuse of a child by a parent, but it can happen in a number of situations where between two individuals, the person with less power or is in more of a state of dependence experiences harm. From there, we can go to the concept of institutional betrayal, which was actually conceptualized by the same psychologist who defined betrayal trauma back in the 90s. We didn't even have that term until the 90s. And a very now celebrated psychologist named Jennifer Fried conceptualized betrayal trauma, and then she expanded that to institutional betrayal, which is when an institution that we depend on, we're a member of, that we trust, causes harm to us. And institutional betrayal can look like things like allowing harms to happen, not creating a safe environment, and it can also look like not responding well when harm does happen, making it difficult to report harm, and then causing more harm to the person who dares report.
That's really helpful. Thanks for sketching those out. Elisabeth, why don't you tell us a little bit about your research on institutional betrayal? And it sounds like you spoke to a lot of survivors to do this work.
Yes. I was so grateful to receive a grant from the Center for Institutional Courage, because there were actually calls to investigate institutional betrayal in the context of clergy perpetrated sexual abuse. And as a survivor of that abuse, I feel like maybe we can hold each other's stories and hopefully conduct research with a minimal amount of harm when we do that in collaboration with each other. So I'm very thankful to have received funding to do the research. So we surveyed 115 survivors from all across the US who experienced abuse either as a child or an adult. And we asked them about their specific experiences, very specific, with types of institutional betrayal and types of victim blaming, which we characterized as DARVO, which we will get to later in this conversation. And we also asked them about their mental health symptoms. And so we found some really astounding things that very much affirm what survivors talk about anecdotally, in that the response from the community can often be much more harmful, or at least layer on a lot of harm from the original abuse. So the finding that's really stark is that 100% of our respondents experienced at least one form of institutional betrayal. So every person had responses that compounded their trauma. We also found that the more forms of institutional betrayal and victim blaming people had experienced, the more symptoms of post-traumatic stress they had, and symptoms of dissociation. So dissociation is a type of trauma response that happens with PTSD, it's kind of a mind-body response that protects us in the moment or afterward from what we've experienced. And the other thing that we found that was really disturbing and I think important, we used a measure of belongingness, and people who experienced more forms of institutional betrayal and more forms of victim blaming had decreased feelings of belongingness. And we all know that that is a very important component of psychological and physical health.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Those are powerful findings. So it's really useful, I think, for all of us to hear sort of how common institutional betrayal is and how this is layering additional trauma on top of the other harms that a person receives in the church. And it's also heartbreaking, the finding about belonging. Thank you. Thanks for sharing those details, Elisabeth. I'd like to go now to Bill to maybe bring these ideas alive with a personal story from your own experience. Bill, what has institutional betrayal look like for you?
Good morning. Yeah, thank you, Aaron. My abuse started, as you said, when I was 16 years old. I was a teenager. Grew up in a devout Catholic family in Utah, and being surrounded by mostly non-Catholics in the area I grew up. My faith was always something that was very personal to me. And early in my teenage years, I began wondering about the priesthood and discerning whether I had a vocation to the priesthood. When I was 16, I met a priest who was new to the diocese, and he took an interest in me. And at some point, I disclosed to him that I've been thinking about a vocation to the priesthood. And he used that to sort of convince me that I needed his spiritual direction, and he had to sort of walk me down this path. And, boundaries started to be crossed slowly at first, talking about sexual things, and then hugs that lingered too long, and it escalated and escalated, and I felt sort of powerless to talk about it. I didn't know how to talk about it, how to frame it. It was all tied to this idea of priesthood that I was discerning, and he sort of imbued the two things that were, that made it so hard to sort of understand. That abuse continued until I was 18. I went away to college, to a seminary in Columbus, Ohio. And I was there for the first about 2 months of my freshman year. And then I had heard that this priest, Father Mejia, who had been my abuser, was expelled from the diocese. And I heard that it was because of sexual deviance. I had never told anybody about mine, so obviously this was regarding other people. And I was so relieved, and it was just sort of a moment I had never told anybody, and it kind of felt like I can just bury it and move on, because now he's gone. But a few months later, I got a call at the seminary from him, from my abuser, Father Mejia, and he wasn't gone. He had simply moved from Salt Lake to Detroit. To this day, 30 years later, I can't get an answer from either the Diocese of Salt Lake or Detroit as to how or why that happened. But he said he was in Detroit. He was functioning as a hospital chaplain, and he was going to come down to the seminary and visit me. And I was too intimidated and afraid to tell him not to come, and I didn't know what to do. I remember just being in panic mode for a week. And then I finally realized I would call my vocation director. My vocation director at the time, Monsignor Robert Bussin, was both vocation director, so he was in charge of those of us seminarians for the diocese, but he was also the vicar general of the diocese. He held both roles, so he was sort of the chief assistant to the bishop and handled much of the administrative work of the diocese. I had known that it was him who expelled Father Mejia from the diocese. So I thought I would just call him and tell him, I got a call from Mejia. He's going to come visit me. Is that okay? I figured I could do that without having to disclose my abuse or anything else. But given the fact that Bussin had just expelled him from the diocese, obviously he would stop the visit. But when I called and we talked for a while, and I finally, told him that I'd heard from Mejia, and Mejia was coming down to visit me, and I asked, "Is that okay?" His response was, "Yes, enjoy your time with him." And for me, that sort of it caused me to question myself instead of my abuser. It sort of produced years and years of self-doubt. And even worse than the self-doubt was the trust issues. I continued in the seminary. So Father Mejia did come my freshman year. He abused me again at the seminary. And that was the last time I ever saw him. I finished my 4 years of college seminary. I went to Rome and did my 4 years of theology. But I just was not at the very end. I postponed my ordination, and then I decided not to be ordained a priest because I could never reconcile my trust issues with the diocese. But I left. I loved my faith, and so I spent 30 years in Catholic education since then. But the trust issues lingered. It took me years to sort of get to a place where I could trust people in a deep and meaningful way. I was divorced twice. And after my second divorce, I started doing some of the therapy and the work to help me deal with those. And God is good. I'm in a great place in a very healthy marriage. My current wife is the first person I ever told the full story to. But for me, that institutional betrayal, when this man who removed the abuser and somehow allowed him to go to another diocese and further allowed him to come from that diocese and abuse me one last time, stole 30 years of trust from me. It took a long time and a lot of hard work to get back.
Thank you, Bill, for sharing the details of your experience. I just want to say I'm sorry for what you experienced, but thank you very much for being open about what the betrayal looked like, and also, how one person can stand in for the institution in a really harmful way. Thank you. So, Elisabeth, take a little bit of a deep breath there. I'm sorry, Esther, I would really like to hear from you now, and perhaps you could share for us another story of your experience, or what you've seen as institutional betrayal.
Yeah. And thank you, Bill, for sharing so honestly and vulnerably. I will have a moment to say that I have heard many stories, many within the context of Awake. The overwhelming majority have had a horrible experience with the reporting process. It's really more the norm than it is the exception. So as I share today, these are more than just stories and statistics, but rather beautiful souls of people I love and I consider friends, and my friends who have experienced deep anguish and betrayal. It's hard to pick one or two stories to share because each story is so deserving of being heard and honored. So I just want to thank each of the survivors here tonight. So just know that your story really does matter. But I was given permission to specifically share this story tonight anonymously, and I have another one I'll share a little bit later. But in this one tragic situation, there was a young woman who was, she came to work at her parish after a really difficult transition in her life, where the parish priest, who was her boss, began to sexually abuse her. And after a great deal of anguish, she took the very, very courageous and hard step to report this abuse to her archdiocese. And instead of responding as a shepherd should respond, they traumatized her not only by disbelieving her, but they actually hired a private investigator to follow her, to try and begin to discredit her They sent people to harass her coworkers and try and coerce false allegations against her and saying that she said things. They bullied her family. They tried to move her from becoming the victim and to being the perpetrator of this crime. This caused really profound, obviously, it would cause really profound damage, but not only to her, but to her relationships. It isolated her. It impacted her relationship with her faith. I mean, her faith was profoundly weaponized against her. I would just imagine and consider how hard it would be to pray after an experience like this, to approach the sacraments, to have any sort of relationship with God, not only because of the sexual abuse by the Catholic leader, a priest in this case, but being treated like a perpetrator rather than the victim, who by the very people who are supposed to represent God. So to a shepherd who turned into a wolf. So as I've walked with many survivors through this process, I've often heard and experienced myself in my own reporting process that it is often more damaging, equally damaging, if not more, than the abuse itself, that the institutional betrayal in these will have a lifelong impact on the survivor and their families.
Thank you, Esther, for sharing those details and sort of explaining them so clearly. I really appreciate that. It's hard to hear. It's hard to hear, but important to know these realities. Elisabeth, I think I'd like to turn to you now and ask you to sort of reflect on what Bill and Esther shared. Is there anything that stands out to you or that particularly resonates for you about what they said based on your research?
Yes. Those are both really heartbreaking case studies of the real impact of the concept. So they really just illustrate the human cost. A couple of things that Bill said. Bill, you said so many things and you said them so well, and I am really, like everyone else, I know, very honored to be able to hear your story. But one of the first things that Bill said is, to this day, I can't get an answer as to why this person was transferred. That's a form of institutional betrayal that is continuing. In addition to calling someone in a position of trust who should be a wise person who had the information, all the information they needed to protect you as a young man, and did not. The story that Esther told, it illustrates something I've been thinking about a lot, because I've heard this so much from personal stories from other survivors I know, that people are being left worse off after trying to report than they were before they tried to report. And that seems to be such a consistent experience. And I think I'll just leave it there. There's not really much more to say than, I think it opens up a lot more questions if we consistently find that people are worse off after reporting than before.
That is a powerful thought and a painful one to hear again. I think that we should move to another topic that was mentioned briefly before. In recent years, researchers have identified a set of tactics that are often used by abusive institutions known as DARVO. 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 Elisabeth, can you talk us through what DARVO is?
Yes, thank you, Erin.
Sure.
So DARVO and institutional DARVO are also conceptualized by Jennifer Fried. And the word DARVO, if this is the first time you're hearing it, I'm delighted to tell you about it, but it's also making its way into the dictionary and just into our everyday speech. So that's really good news, because knowing about DARVO reduces its impact on the victim. So DARVO is deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. So the perpetrator denies the harm, they attack the credibility of the victim, and then they reverse the victim and offender roles by suddenly they're the victim of false accusations. So it's just a manipulation tactic. It flips reality on its head. The problem is, until we were able to put words to this, it worked. So it works in diminishing the credibility of the victim, and it also works on the victim's self-doubt. It causes a lot of self-doubt and a lot of confusion. And it's one of the reasons why sometimes people recant or change their story to nothing happened, because it's just telling the truth is actually harder than just silencing.
Wow. Okay. Maybe you could give us an example of what DARVO looks like so that we can sort of recognize it. Do you have an example you could share?
Esther gave us a really great example just now. That was a great example of institutional DARVO. But basically, you're going to see things like looking into the victim's background, finding the vulnerabilities of the victim, finding abuse causes mental health issues. And so DARVO will take that mental health issue as a reason that the person's not credible, when actually the mental health issue is a piece of evidence that this happened. And so that's kind of classic. The other thing is just outright minimizing. The denial piece involves minimizing what happened. Oh, they just misunderstood. That's just the way he is. He didn't mean anything by it. So that's the denial piece. We have the credibility piece, and then we have, oh, no, these are false accusations. This could destroy so-and-so's career or ministry. And I think you all are probably familiar with the statistics on false accusations. We have a much better chance of doing the right thing if we proceed as though the accusations are correct and go from there. Otherwise, we're sacrificing the victim to protect the perpetrator.
Yeah, thanks for sketching that out. Esther, I think this would be a good time to see if you have any thoughts about DARVO or DARVO in the survivors that you have walked with or in your own experience.
Yeah. Kind of piggybacking off of what Elisabeth said, the mental health piece, and very often too, sometimes perpetrators will pick people who have pre-existing mental health issues because they're easier targets, and they'll be disbelieved. And so there's like this whole process of like grooming a community that comes into play. But one of the things that I have seen is that like when a survivor is discredited, it begins to impact our own like view of reality. Like, am I remembering this right? And then like I start to kind of gaslight myself or start to disbelieve myself and start to have those insecurities. But there's also this whole element of how survivors are often viewed in the church, that we're viewed like we're just seeking money or we're these liabilities. Very often when a survivor will approach a diocese, that they're viewed rather like a liability to them rather than rather than the wounded son or daughter in front of them, like this beloved child of God, that they're instead reduced to rather how much money will I have to pay? Or in some cases, we're viewed as pariah or outcasts within the church, that we don't feel like we belong. And so like this kind of institutional view of survivors of being these crazy, money hungry, or false accusations, or we're just seeking whatever. When it's very often the case that we would pay money just for this never to have existed, this never to have happened, to be put in this position.
Mm. Yeah, thank you, Esther. Bill, do you have any insights about DARVO or experiences with it that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, so as I said, after my experience, I continued through the seminary and ultimately didn't get ordained, and worked in Catholic education, and still had never reported, though, at some point years later, started dealing with some of the trauma, and finding sort of a healthy way through it. But it wasn't until 3 years ago, my brother was a fire captain who suffered from a lot of PTSD, and he took his life 3 years ago. And that was a moment where all of my trauma just came back to me, and I didn't want to carry it. So that was when I reported. I reported to the Diocese of Salt Lake City 30 years after the abuse had happened. And I didn't hear back. I sent a letter. I didn't hear back for a month and at all. And when I did hear back, the bishop wrote me a letter, which basically said he hoped that my writing was cathartic. And that was sort of it. So I wrote back and said, no, I think you misunderstood. I'm writing to formally report my sexual abuse. And then obviously the process started. And it was difficult. And I dealt with the victim's assistant coordinator who, offered counseling, but was very reluctant to start an investigation. And then I continued to push. And ultimately they did. And the evidence was pretty clear. So after it took them 7 months, but they acknowledged the abuse. They sort of had to and apologized for it. But I was concerned because there were other instances, like the vicar general who let this man go to another diocese and let him come visit me at a seminary. The vicar general after him, there were concerns that he had been destroying church documents. And so I challenged, so the diocese issued a press release acknowledging my abuse, but none of the other concerns. So I wrote my own press release and sent it out and thanked them for that, but challenged them to look into the aspects of cover-up. And, some news media outlets picked up my press release, and that was problematic for the diocese. And so the same day that the bishop had sent out a public apology for the abuse I endured, the vicar general emailed a mass email to leaders throughout the diocese to give context to my press release, in which he described me as kind of an unhinged, crazy person. He described me specifically as frantic and inappropriate, rude, imprecise understanding of what happened. And I remember very distinctly the sort of pastoral middle finger he gave me at the end, where he wrote to, and I wasn't copied on this. I was only given it because I have friends who work in the diocese who shared this with me later. But his last line was, "Nevertheless, we will treat him with kindness and whatever pastoral care he allows." And so literally the same day the bishop is acknowledging that I was abused, the vicar general is sending this email to leaders throughout the diocese, explaining to them what a problematic person I am. Because my experience sort of spanned multiple dioceses, obviously Salt Lake City, but then the priest had faculties in Detroit when he came down to Columbus and molested me when I was in college seminary, and the molestation took place in Columbus. So over time, because Salt Lake City was being so reticent to help, I reported in both Detroit and I reported in Columbus. So I dealt with 3 victims assistance coordinators and clergy members in all dioceses. And And the experience was the same. Detroit, I couldn't get anywhere. I was unsure of the exact dates that he came down, as it was 30 years ago. And so they used that as evidence that that I wasn't being honest. And I requested a meeting with Archbishop Weisenberger in Detroit directly. And I quoted the Dallas Charter and all the things that we're all familiar with, and Vos Estis Lex Mundi, and the Episcopal vicar for clergy discipline wrote back and pointed out that one, I had passed my 18th birthday at the time of that final assault, and two, the diocese had only granted him temporary faculties when he had abused me, not permanent faculties. And based on those, he made it clear that the diocese had no responsibility, that Archbishop Weisenberger would not meet with me. And then they basically said it was Columbus's issue. So I reported to Columbus, and that was problematic right from the start. I got an acknowledgement that they received my letter, and that they would get back to me soon. But a week passed, 2 weeks passed. I started writing and writing and writing. I wrote half a dozen times over a period of 7 weeks. Eventually had to sort of go through human resources at the Archdiocese and file a complaint, make a complaint that nobody would talk to me. And 7 weeks after I reported, the Victims Assistance Coordinator finally called me. And again, I don't believe that ever would have happened if not for my constant persistence. Finally, I was able to get a meeting with Bishop Fernandez in Columbus. And so I flew at my own expense from Los Angeles to Columbus to get 45 minutes of his time. And when I got there, instead of letting me tell my story, he wanted to tell me his understanding of my story. So I flew across the country at my expense to listen to the bishop narrate my story back to me. And the details of my story evolved as he told it to me. What happened when Mejia came to college and abused me, we went out to dinner at a restaurant. He followed me into the bathroom and sexually assaulted me. And somehow in the bishop's telling, we were out drinking, and I didn't have my first drink till a few years later. My senior year of college, I had my first drink. Freshman year, I was completely foreign to alcohol, but we were out drinking at a bar across the street, which was kind of known to be a pickup place of the seminary, a bar that in 4 years of college I had never set foot in. But in his telling my story back to me, we were all out drinking at this bar and an incident happened. And that was how he sort of described it. So in all three dioceses, it was almost like they were reading from a playbook. It was absolutely what you're describing with DARVO. The victims assistance coordinators tried to push me away, and when they couldn't and I kept going, then other people stepped in and started the questioning of my credibility, and then changing the stories and sending emails to people to give context that I wasn't a healthy person. So in all three dioceses, I experienced the exact same thing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those details. And I would invite folks in the audience, if you're interested in learning more about Bill's story, the Salt Lake Tribune has done a lot of reporting and followed up on his story at each step along the way. And if you go to bishopaccountability.org, you can check out those stories for yourself. But thank you, Bill, for sharing what has taken place for you. I'd also like to invite folks in the audience. You're hearing lots of interesting ideas and really evocative, powerful things. And if you have any questions for our panelists, please go ahead and send those through the chat to Catherine Hours, who is collecting the questions for us to share with our panelists in a little bit. But let's move on now. Esther, I know that in your previous role with Awake, you have walked with, obviously many people who've experienced institutional betrayal, and that victim survivors can experience institutional betrayal, as we've heard, from high up in the church, even at the level of the Vatican. But we also know that institutional betrayal can occur much closer to home. And so I would invite you, could you talk a little bit about what this looks like at sort of the local level?
It's a really great question. So there's kind of several aspects that I could share, but I want to kind of narrow it down. One of the things I kind of alluded to before is very often when a perpetrator moves into a situation, they groom a community. It's not just the victim, but rather of how they'll be perceived and how to discredit the survivor when they tell their story. But there's also, as we had mentioned, we had talked about kind of just this overall view of survivors and of how they're portrayed by church leaders, but also by the media, and just what people's preconceptions might be. But there was one situation that of a friend of mine, of what she went through, that I'd like to share. When she reported to her diocese, she was one of the very few that actually had a really positive and pastoral response from her diocese. They received her well. The priest was removed. They provided her counseling, ongoing pastoral support. But where the problem began to lie is that priest, after he was laicized, still had connections within the parish, and there were rumors that began to spread, and rumors about her and false accusations that were made about her. And my friend had deep roots in this parish and many friends, and her kids went to school there. She was very involved. But it became to the point that no one would associate with her. They openly gossiped about her. They would move out of the room if she walked in. They treated her children poorly. She was openly gossiped and ostracized by the people she believed loved her. So her betrayal, so she experienced ritualistic sexual abuse. It was that spanned years. So she was dealing with some really deep trauma, and the people that she would normally go to for support they not only turned their backs on her, but blamed her for these betrayals. And the new priest that came in and was assigned to her parish was extremely cold towards her. And he had the opportunity to be Christ's healing balm in her life. And instead, he further damaged, and he furthered that wound by not only his cold indifference, but by believing the rumors rather than what the diocese was telling him. And so she experienced being isolated and ostracized by lay people mostly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out and sharing that story. Very painful. And also, it, makes it clear that institutional betrayal is not just something that's coming from the highest leaders in the church, that it can also take place at this very local level. I'm so sorry to hear that, Esther, but thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think that it would be good for us to go on to talking about prevention. This is all very heavy, right? This is hard to hear. And I wonder, about sort of prevention. Elisabeth, how do we create institutions that, don't cause this type of harm in the first place? What can you offer us?
First, I want to acknowledge what Esther just told us about, and just mention that across types of religious organizations, it is typically the survivor who loses community over time. And I think that's one reason why what Awake does is so important, is you are providing a safe community for survivors within the faith. But that is universal, that somehow the person who had more power to begin with is able to maintain community or stay in the community, even if they get moved around or are laicized, and the person who was a victim eventually loses community. So I digress, but let me get back to the prevention. So we're human, and there's probably a lot more research that needs to be done about why we scapegoat individuals. There's some thought that we think by doing that it's going to keep us safe, that this could never happen to us or our child. Unfortunately, reality, that's not accurate. And we have a real need to belong. So we probably need to figure out and face those features of being human before we can create safe organizations. But I did make a list of suggestions based on the Center for Institutional Courage and some things that they've put out, because this is their purpose for existing, to create courageous institutions. One of them is to beware the risk management mentality. Don't let the lawyers and the insurance companies tell you how to respond or how to do your moral duty. They will always say, don't admit liability, but we're not going to change these hidden patterns of sexualized violence by not admitting what's happening. Another is respond well to disclosures. Survivors in our culture have every reason not to disclose. Advocates know and survivors know, and they go through a long decision-making process before they even tell anyone in a position of power who can change something. And so it's a big conversation with your advocate. Am I even going to disclose? That's how difficult it is to disclose. So when that finally happens, realize the courage that went behind that and just proceed as though this is serious and accurate. Currently, as a society, we only hold accountable about 1% of sexual violence. So we can do a lot more. We know sexualized violence is everywhere. It's hidden. So we can do a lot more before we need to even start worrying about false accusations affecting our society broadly. Sexual abuse is affecting our society broadly. Cherish whistleblowers. They are not being used by Satan to harm the church, as they are so often accused. This is an incredibly harmful accusation to the individual. It makes it very difficult to be a whistleblower. And again, that's sacrificing victims to protect some false sense of safety and trust, false sense of trust. Be transparent about data and policies. Reporting policies should not be a mystery. It should not be difficult to report. It should be obvious how many reports have been made in a certain place. Records should be open. When it comes to investigations, when they do finally happen, they should be independent, they should be third party, and they should be trauma informed. They should focus on the actions of the perpetrator and center the needs of the survivor. So often internal investigations do the opposite. They also should not be limited down in scope, such that we can't really find patterns. So part of what we're looking at is patterns of behavior by institutions and by individuals. And when we try to say, oh, it's just this situation or this one time, and we don't link together the dots that show us the pattern, we're just missing a lot of information that is in fact available to us. And finally, Christian institutions need to make resources available for survivor care. Unfortunately, church institutions have been a haven for sexual perpetrators, probably throughout history, in all types of Christian institutions. These institutions have a lot of resources, and yet the resources for survivors are incredibly slim. They're very difficult to access. And survivors should not have to file a lawsuit in order to receive care. Just having to do that, having to do a suit is more trauma in and of itself, because defense attorneys basically engage in DARVO. That's how they defend. So having to go down that road it's unconscionable for us to ask survivors to ever do that. That's everything on my list.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those very concrete ideas. I wanted to ask you too, I know that there are people in the audience who work for the church in various capacities and want to do the right thing, want to help the church to develop more institutional courage. What would you say to them today as they're sort of thinking about this problem of institutional betrayal?
Well, first, I want to acknowledge how difficult that is, because again, we all have a need. These are our communities. This is a big part of our identity. Our religion and spirituality is a big part of our life, and we need this community. So it takes a tremendous amount of courage and fortitude, and this causes a lot of stress. People who will advocate will receive and experience some of the same treatment that the survivor victim receives. And so I want to acknowledge how difficult that is. So as you try to educate leadership on these topics, what is the research? What are the dynamics on institutional betrayal, DARVO? What are the patterns? Also have your own community so you can link arms with others. It's so easy. The pressure on us to be silent and not do anything is the fear of isolation. And so we really need to stay linked in community as we bravely use our voices and bring up things that our entire society would rather stay hidden.
Yeah. Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you. I think that based on the time, I just want to keep us moving. But I think this is a really beautiful time based, Elisabeth, on what you said about community, for us to turn to the topic of healing, these really painful wounds left by institutional betrayal, and how we can begin to heal them in the survivor community. Esther, could we start with you? And I wonder if you have anything to offer in terms of, ways to heal from institutional trauma. I know that community is something that you've spoken really passionately about. And so I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Thank you. Elisabeth just said it so eloquently about the power and the need for community, both in fighting against institutional betrayal, but I also believe in healing from it. So often, as a survivor myself, but also others that I have walked with, we feel this element of isolation. And we have the beautiful opportunity of having survivor circles in our community. And there is something so profoundly beautiful when you're sitting across the circle from someone and all of a sudden you realize, like, oh, I'm not alone in that. And you have that moment of recognition and that moment of community. And so many times, many survivors, as we talked about earlier, have lost so much of their community and are feeling isolated and alone. And when we find that community, that time together, so there's that kind of external community, but there's also when a family or a friend or a spouse or someone close to us stays close to us and loves us, even when things are ugly and hard and painful. And it is in those relationships we also find deep healing. So there's, to begin to say, like, how does one heal from it is like so individual for everybody. But a common thing that I have found is through community and through relationship, that there is a great wealth of ability to find healing together.
Beautiful. Thank you, Esther. Thank you. Bill, I know that the wounds of your experience, particularly with the dioceses that you've been working with, have been really painful. But I'm wondering, have there been sort of moments in the last few years that you found healing that you would be willing to talk about, sort of what has helped you with those particular wounds in particular?
Yeah, sure. And I would certainly echo Esther's response of relationship. I mean, and I'm very lucky at this point in my life to be in a healthy marriage and to have a wonderful relationship with my daughter. I think so much of my daughter's 15 now, and I think it was when she was born that I started doing therapy around this. I think just wanting to be somebody worthy of her trust, I sort of found my way back to trusting others. But that was a long process. But for me, certainly relationships, and I'm so fortunate to have such meaningful relationships in my life that have been healing. But I would also say acknowledgement is such a critical part of healing, and the basic decency of validation. And I just find in the 3 dioceses that I dealt with, the process is simply not oriented toward help of the victim. It's oriented toward protection of the diocese and protection of the bishop. So honestly, I think part of the healing for me was sort of finally recognizing I have never filed a lawsuit or consulted an attorney. That was something I never wanted to do for personal reasons. And I never wanted to go to the press, but 5 months in and just realizing the diocese was not going to acknowledge this without some pressure, I went to the press, and external pressure I found in all 3 dioceses was kind of the only thing that ever moved the needle. And so, I mean, as people search for healing, I don't know if this comes across as cynical, but I would say, look outward. The diocesan process is not our friend in many cases. And so seeking validation from police, from media, from lawyers, from legal counsel, from lawsuits, if that's where validation and acknowledgement is going to be found, then that is part of healing.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, and thank you for sharing the details of your healing and relationships, the power of the relationships in your life. Really beautiful. Elisabeth, I wonder if you might have anything to share in terms of, is there anything specific that research shows, for example, might benefit people who have experienced institutional betrayal?
Yes, actually there is, and this is pretty well established, just in terms of betrayals overall and abuse overall, but specifically DARVO and institutional betrayal. Naming it, having the language, and being able to recognize the pattern is incredibly powerful in and of itself. In therapy, we call this psychoeducation. It's just powerful to know what the dynamics are. Finding safety from ongoing harm. So as Bill said, you might have to go outside to get validation, because being invalidated is harm. Having your experience invalidated, having your experience narrated back to you in a way that is completely inaccurate and reflects poorly on you and not the perpetrator is harm. And so rebuild belonging. Just focusing on what Esther said, rebuilding belonging, and that might have to happen outside. Grieving, because betrayal requires grief and process. Finding trauma-informed professional support that understands religious betrayal, and not being on a timeline. The pressure to be on a certain timeline to recover is also a harm in and of itself. So having a lot of patience for yourself, surrounding yourself with community that also understands that timelines, forgiveness are not helpful.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and that's something that we have all heard in the Awake community about, sort of there's no sort of linear timeline to healing, right? Yeah, thank you for bringing that idea up. I think it's time for us to go to some audience questions. We had some that were submitted when people registered, and we have some really good ones. I wanted to start with one. We've talked a lot about DARVO and this powerful idea, these tactics that we all need to be using the word DARVO, making it part of our vocabulary. But Elisabeth, as our sort of resident DARVO expert, what would you say, this was a question from the audience, what would you say are the best responses for someone who is experiencing DARVO? How should a survivor respond in the face of DARVO?
Well, again, naming it is very powerful. So once we realize that we are in the storm of that dynamic, it can kind of help us calm down and have some clarity. Know that the self-doubt that you experience is the intended effect. Know that actually the research shows that it does work, but also just knowing the DARVO tactics and that we're experiencing it also helps a lot. And so for us to know it personally when we're experiencing it, but also for people in general to be educated about it. And just know that this is a thing that we all do when we're confronted. So we can also have a little piece of self-growth and notice when we're defending ourselves in this way, oh, I did that. And then we can work on our own patterns. So that's just a little side bonus. But when you are in that conversation and you begin to feel confused and feel like maybe you're the problem for bringing up the harm that you experienced, you can remove yourself from that conversation. You can set a boundary and step back. We keep trying as survivors. We keep trying, thinking if they just understood, things would be different. But also sometimes we have evidence that that's not really the case. And so we do get to step back and take care of ourselves. We don't have to engage in conversations that perpetuate harm against us. And then in that stepping back, find a more objective person, somebody outside of the system to support and validate you. I wish I could give you just a verbal jujitsu response to the person who's DARVOing you. But that is usually dependent on both people in the conversation being able to have emotional intelligence and boundary skills and communication skills. So I wish I could tell you that, but
yeah,
I can say just know it and take care of yourself.
Right, great. And I guess we'll all be sort of searching our minds for that verbal jujitsu. Like that would be a wonderful thing to be able to have the one-liner in response to DARVO. I think let's go. Thank you for that. It's really helpful. We have another question here. I'm going to read it so that I get it right. But here we go. They may be few and far between, but there have been some cases when a church representative or system gets it right. When the victim receives appropriate care, when a perpetrator is held accountable, how can institutions appropriately hold or lift up the truth of a few good apples without overinflating the goodness within the system, or without understating the tremendous work that's still left to accomplish? So yeah, how do we go about sort of highlighting the good that happens within the institution without overlooking sort of the broader dysfunction? Does anybody have thoughts to share? I wonder if Elisabeth, you have something to go with first.
Thank you. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is checking in with the survivor to make sure that they feel that things went well. and knowing that over time that could change. Sometimes early on, because we all do want to belong, we do want to stay part of the community, things might appear to be going well, but upon reflection later, it could even be years or decades later, we realize where we took on responsibility that wasn't ours, or where we went into kind of our social safety system, which is also called FAWN. I prefer social safety system. Just to kind of get along and get through the situation. So confirm with the survivor that that's the case, that it went well. Once that's confirmed, look at the specifics of the situation. What was it that went well? Who was centered? What were the specifics that happened? And study it. What structures were in place? And then hold it up as this is the way it should be, rather than evidence that this is the way it is. And ask the question, why isn't it always this way? And how can we make it this way?
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks for articulating that. Esther or Bill, do you have anything to add? Yeah, it's okay if you don't. Bill, it looks like you were about to speak.
Yeah, and I don't want this to sound adversarial, but at the same time, my experience in 3 different dioceses, and nearly every conversation I had with the bishop, either in person or correspondences, usually within the first 10 minutes of the meeting or within the second paragraph of the letter, they sort of take a sidetrack into assuring me that they personally have done everything right. And that's enormously frustrating when so much wrong has been done. So I guess my response is, I think the church does a very good job of holding up the good apples, and I think they hold up a lot of bad apples as good apples. And I guess my point is, I don't think that's a priority. I think there are a lot of people suffering from institutions that have wronged them that need to be acknowledged.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Bill, articulating that. Okay. So I would like to, this next question sort of goes back to something that Esther, you mentioned earlier, and I think it's worth revisiting. Occasionally survivors of abuse in the church will say something like, the institutional betrayal I experienced was in some ways equally or even more painful than the initial abuse. And I think that probably there are people in the broader Catholic community who might be surprised or even shocked by that observation. So we don't want to ask you to speak for all survivors, Esther, but could you sort of describe for us, what might be behind a statement like that? What would cause someone to say, actually, the institutional response hurt me more than the abuse itself?
Yeah, I will be careful to not speak for all survivors, so I'll just speak to my own story. In this case, so I was raped in my early 20s by a priest, and I attempted to report it. And he was from a different diocese, and I began writing letters and trying to get any sort of response that I could. And what the long of the short of it is when I met with the cardinal of the archdiocese of where it happened, he looked at me and he said, when I heard your story, Esther, I was so glad to hear you weren't a man and you weren't a minor. And to me, then I was the acceptable victim. Now, you have to understand from my perspective, I had converted into the church. I had been a lay missionary. I had devoted myself to loving her and gave my life for the church in many ways. And when those words, it didn't even kind of set in that moment in that meeting, but as it kind of sat and lingered in the air, I realized that this shepherd, this man who was supposed to protect me from the wolves, was essentially saying I was okay as the sacrificial lamb. Like it was okay for this to happen to me, that my dignity as a person was not enough to be protected. And now I know many years later in my healing journey, that was a lie and that wasn't truth. But in that moment, it felt so very real. And so many survivors, when we report and we go to the church, we go expecting to be protected, expecting for them to have the same moral horror that they have over, someone being murdered. Sorry, that's a bad analogy, but we expect them to hold a moral horror for what of this a grievous sin that occurred. But instead, we are turned into the perpetrator because of DARVO, because of all these things that we talked about, because it's denied. And so like it really is this betrayal of your crime. Like what happened to you doesn't even not matter. It's your fault. Like it is your fault. And so it compounds this shame and it compounds this horror and it further isolates us from the community and it weaponizes our very faith, the very thing that is so often healing for a survivor. It weaponizes it against us. So we don't even have that to fall back to. And again, this is me speaking from my experience. I know every survivor is so uniquely different, but it is a common element that I've seen throughout.
Mm-hmm. Esther, thank you for sharing that really painful memory. And thanks for articulating that experience so well, so clearly. I'm so sorry. I think that, So another question that has been submitted is a tough one. And I'm going to ask maybe Elisabeth if you could consider trying for it first. Let's see. Let me read it to you, and you can let us know if this is something you'd like to take on. But how do you navigate relationships with enablers of institutional betrayal, the people who choose to believe, defend, protect the perpetrators, or who try to remain, in quotations, neutral? Do you have any advice on that front?
This is incredibly painful, and it is because this is an intersection of our identity, our community, our faith, and that enabling or that neutral stance is a harm. It is an invalidation of our life experience. It is doing active harm to survivors to try to stay in community with folks like that. I don't have a good answer. I think I have an answer from, like, this is from a therapist perspective, is that we can choose not to stay in some relationships. We may go through our relationships one by one and look at where we need to create distance to protect ourselves. Another thing that we can do is really keep working on our own internal compass, our own internal strength and our resources, because the more resourced we are internally, and that includes having clarity about what happened to us, having clarity about the dynamics, being able to name things, having clarity about our mutual humanity and how these pressures of belongingness are crushing all of us. When we're really strong in ourselves, we may have more capacity to stay in relationships with other people and understand where they are. But I really want to stress that you get to take care of your nervous system and yourself first. I know that's hard, that some people may not understand when you need to pull back, when you need to do that. But you get to balance that and make those choices. One thing that is so inherent in the trauma of sexualized violence is the removal of choice. There's a lot of coercion. There's a lot of double binds, limited choice, but there's not real choice and agency. So anything that you can do to support your practice of your own agency and your choice making, large and small, is going to build those internal resources.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I think this is a really good place to pause our conversation for a moment. I just want to let the audience know that we're going to come back to our speakers in a moment. But I just first want to thank each of you. Elisabeth, thank you for sharing your expertise and your really powerful knowledge, for illuminating institutional betrayal for us in this way. Thank you, Bill and Esther, for sharing so vulnerably and authentically and honestly today. It was really beautiful and powerful to get to hear from you, and we're grateful to you for trusting us with your stories. And so with that, I'd like to switch over to Catherine Hours, who will take things from here.
Hi, everyone. And I'll echo Erin's thanks. So many really intense and deep things shared that I think we're all going to be thinking about for quite a while. My name is Catherine Hours, and I'm on Awake staff and part of our Courageous Conversations planning team. One intention of this series is to inspire personal action. And so we're going to invite our panelists back on screen in just a moment to share some closing thoughts about actions we each might consider taking. I do want to share a couple of announcements first. Our final Courageous Conversation of this season is scheduled for Thursday, May 14th, and it will be on the topic of restorative justice, which I think is going to be a really nice follow-up to this month's conversation. Awake's next public event will be our annual Way of the Cross with Survivors, which combines reflections from survivors of abuse by Catholic leaders with the traditional stations of the cross devotion. And this is going to take place on Wednesday, March 18th at 7 p.m. Our follow-up email is going to include more details about this and a feedback survey that includes registration for part 2 of this Courageous Conversation, which will take place in 1 week on Thursday, February 19th in the evening at 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern. This is really a chance to break into small groups and discuss what we heard today. I really hope you'll consider joining us. So now I am going to ask our panelists to return for some final thoughts. What action step would you recommend to our audience members who want to do something to prevent the harm of institutional betrayal in their corner of the church or in their community? Bill, could we start with you, please?
Sure. Yeah. And as I had a lot of things going through my head, I guess, as I was thinking about this particular question. For some reason, this one seemed a little more challenging than others. But I think I was told, I don't know the makeup of the audience entirely, but I was told there are victims assistance coordinators in the audience. And I guess I would sort of appeal to them and to people who hold those roles. My experience in 3 different dioceses were that the victims assistance coordinators just were not willing or able to offer assistance. And at certain points, in all 3 dioceses, at certain points, victims assistance coordinators became indistinguishable from diocesan legal counsel. In fact, at many points was I receiving letters that were clearly written by legal counsel that were signed by victims assistance coordinators. I guess my point would be, the Dallas Charter makes it so clear that advocates for victims are advocates for victims. And my experience is that advocates for victims that I've encountered are often advocates until they're told by a vicar general or a bishop that they need to back off in the interest of some other priority. So I guess, my appeal would be to victims assistance coordinators that if that's a vocation you choose, I would implore you to have the integrity to challenge diocesan legal counsel in order to assist victims, to challenge vicar generals in order to assist victims, and to challenge bishops. Deference from those who are meant to help victims to the authority that has already harmed them only re-traumatizes victims. And I would say that if victims assistance coordinators aren't able to first and foremost be the advocate of the victim and not the employee of the diocese, that they're going to cause much more harm than good.
Thank you for sharing that. Esther, can we turn to you now? What action step would you recommend for people who want to do something to prevent institutional betrayal?
Well, this is my action step as I thought and prayed on this is less about prevention, but more about ways that we can respond to some of the harm that's been done. Awake has within it a encourager ministry. And this is a simple ministry of ways to send words of support to those who share their stories on the Awake's blog. Occasionally, we'll do some cards to somebody that's in particular need within our community. And it's just a really beautiful and simple way. It's not a huge commitment, but a very tangible way that we can be church for one another and build that community for so many survivors who have lost a lot of support around them.
Thank you. Elisabeth, what thoughts do you have to share in terms of an action step?
I love what Esther said about that tangible form of support. That's so important for community building. And also, Bill, I appreciate your bravery in your words. So I want to put in a plug for research. The rest of the world is very interested in these concepts, very interested in the research. So as survivors can participate in research without harm to themselves, because it is innately activating to participate in research. I'm trying to make my research more and more trauma informed, and so less so. But as survivors can participate, and for others to read that research, because this is science. I mean, we're doing this scientifically. This is real. And there's an excellent website called clergysexualmisconduct.com that tracks research as it comes out. And so that's a place to access these concepts, and knowledge is power. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you really very much. So as we close, the leadership of Awake is motivated by our faith to do this work. When we gather, we pray together. And so we will end today with a short prayer, and we invite anyone who wishes to stay to join us in our prayer. We also know that there are good reasons that some may not choose to stay. And if you'd like to sign off now, please know that we wish you peace and goodness, and we hope to see you again soon. Now, as we begin our closing prayer, let us remind ourselves that, as always, we are in the presence of God, who is love. And feeling that presence now, we collect ourselves, knowing that listening is an act of love. Thank you, loving God, for bringing us together this afternoon and giving us the sacred gifts of community and the wisdom that we have heard today. May we hold each other in our hearts, each doing our part to cultivate love, hope, and healing that leaves no one out and no one behind as we continue to build this beloved community. Amen.